doing so, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michael Sudarkasa, and I'm the CEO of the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership. I want to welcome everyone to our conversation this afternoon on Africa's fertilizer and soil health vision. We've had and will have a number of conversations about soil health this week, which is excellent. But this afternoon, we're taking some slightly different themes. I'll also be moderating the first of our two sessions. We have roughly 2 hours to get through and have you hear from a number of core stakeholders and representatives of institutions who are working vigorously in the soil health and fertilizer industries. I have the pleasure, though, of welcoming to the stage for our introductory remarks the Honorable Mizingo Pinda, who is the former Prime Minister of this great nation that is hosting us, the Republic of Tanzania. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Honorable Pinda to come to the dais and give us his introductory remarks. Thank you. Can we give him a hand of applause as he comes up?
Okay. Dear brothers and sisters, good evening. As I've been introduced, I've been the Prime Minister of this country for about 7 years. And in 2015 is when I retired. But I always say retiring is not getting tired. No. So I'm still on. So presently I'm the chairman of the Presidential Council that has been mandated now to work closely with the Minister of Agriculture, Livestock and Fisheries and advise accordingly on how best we can help this country to attain the goals that have been placed through various conferences and other orders. So I'm here to sort of just briefly talk about a case that everybody knows. It's about fertilizers, but also the soil health, according to the program. And as a person from this country, let me also join hands and welcome you all to Tanzania, but more so to Dar es Salaam. And thanks, the weather is not as bad now. Otherwise, if you had come at another time, sun was very hot, but this time still cool. I thank God for enabling me to be with you and stand before you for this very, very important meeting. So, dear brothers, ladies and gentlemen, crop production is among important components of food systems. To ensure sustainable crop production, use of appropriate agricultural inputs, including fertilizers, is important to meet food requirements of the growing population in Africa. It is projected that Africa population will grow from 1.46 billion people this year to 2.5 billion by 2050. Use of fertilizers, therefore, contributes to the increase of crop production, food availability, but also quality. And according to the International Fertilizer Association, IFA, for every 1 kilogram of nutrient applied through fertilizers, farmers obtain 5 to 30 kilograms of additional product. It's also estimated that 50% of the food we eat in the world is being produced with the use of mineral fertilizers. So it's obvious that this is an important ingredient in the process we are in. The use of fertilizers by farmers in Africa is still very, very low. It is approximately 7 million nutrient tons for combined nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium use, and this amount accounts for around 3% of global fertilizer consumption. There are several factors attributing to low fertilizer use. Among them, and this includes, 1, limited access to fertilizers and low financial ability of smallholder farmers. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, more than 60% of the population are smallholder farmers who, most of them, struggle to live and feed their families on less than $2 a day, according to the African Union Commission in 2019. Therefore, the financial ability limits them to use fertilizer with the amount that is required. The average fertilizer application rate in sub-Saharan Africa is also low, though it's growing with very low pace from 6 kilograms per hectare of nutrients in the year 2000 to about 15 kilograms per hectare in 2017. And according to African Union Commission 2019, the rate was projected to reach about 19 kilograms per hectare per year by 2021. The rate is below the Abuja Declaration of Fertilizer for the African Green Revolution, which is set a target of increasing the level of use of fertilizer to an average of at least 50 kilograms of nutrients per hectare. Nitrogen is the dominant fertilizer used in Africa, responsible for over 75% of urea, but also ammonium nitrates and sulfates. Today, the demand of fertilizers in Africa is estimated to be 5.0 million nutrient tons of nitrogen, phosphate 1.3 million nutrients tons, and potash 0.7 million nutrient tons, making a total of 7 million nutrient tons. In Tanzania, fertilizer utilization is estimated to be 19 kilograms per hectare, also less than 50% of the Abuja Declaration of using 50 kilograms per hectare fertilizer nutrients. Utilization of fertilizer varieties between 300,000 tons to 500 metric tons per annum, which is equivalent to 28 to 40% of the soil requirements. For instance, in 23-24 cropping season, fertilizer demand in Tanzania was approximated to be 848,800 metric tons of fertilizers, which also shows the fertilizer consumption in Tanzania is slowly increasing. Brothers and sisters, Africa continent produces approximately 30 million metric tons of fertilizer each year, twice as much as it consumes, and the major fertilizer producing countries being Egypt, Tunisia, South Africa, Algeria, Nigeria, and Morocco. These countries have a developed fertilizer industry and also a high level of fertilizer use. In sub-Saharan Africa, phosphate rock processing takes place in Mali, Senegal, and Togo, while phosphate fertilizer is produced primarily in Kenya, Madagascar, Nigeria, the United Republic of Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. In general, most of the fertilizers used in Africa are imported, while those produced in Africa are exported outside the continent. That's a dilemma. Nevertheless, some degree of inter-regional and intra-regional trade in fertilizers in Africa does occur. Much of the trade involves landlocked countries importing from and through coastal countries and other African countries. In Tanzania, almost 90% of the fertilizer consumed is imported, and less than 10% is domestically manufactured. About 100% of all urea, ammonium-related fertilizers are imported from different countries, including Russia. Russian-Ukraine war, which started in the year 2022, has increased the prices and also created shortage of fertilizers as a result. This situation contributed to limited availability of fertilizers and food insecurity to some countries in Africa. With the war now in its second year, that is 2023, high international food prices have moderated, though domestic prices levels remain high in many low and middle income countries. To ease the adverse impact of these fertilizer prices, governments in some countries, in some African countries, including Tanzania, have started to implement fertilizer subsidy program. And for example, in 2022, the prices in Tanzania with government subsidy have been reduced from around US dollars 1,100 per ton to $600 to 700 tons. So, the low fertilizer uses in most African countries have resulted to a continuous soil depletion and low crop yield and hence non-sustainable food systems. According to International Fertilizer Association report 2019, about 75 to 80% of all cultivated area is characterized by graded soils, and this affects 65% of the Africans. For example, studies conducted by the International Fertilizer Development Corporation in the last 15 years indicates that nutrient depletion was highest, more than 60 kilograms NPK per hectare yearly in agricultural areas in Guinea, Congo, Angola, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda. And fertilizer utilization is still low in these countries. Other factors contributing to high nutrient losses are soil erosion and leaching. At that time, nutrient mining across Africa ranges from 9 kilograms NPK per hectare per year in Egypt to 88 kilograms in Somalia and East Africa. We need to set strategies to optimize fertilizer use and soil health for sustainable food systems in Africa. We also need to identify available opportunities, which include the following: investment in fertilizer manufacturing using available raw materials such as natural gas deposits, phosphate rock deposits, and potash deposits. 2, strengthen regional integration for fertilizer trade, regional trade blocks. 3, farmers' capacity building on the use of fertilizers and management of the soil health is also important. 4, investment on soil health research is required heavily. And lastly, the strengthening of extension services, which in most countries, including Tanzania, is still a challenge. Excellencies, brothers and sisters, having said that, I take this opportunity to encourage all stakeholders to fully participate in strengthening investment in the fertilizer industry, hence facilitating access to agricultural inputs and strengthening food systems in Africa. With that said, I want to say thank you so much for listening, and now we can go into the other project aspects. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I hope I've been a good student.
No, you've done excellent. Colleagues, as you know, there's a lot going on this week, and you find yourselves at times struggling to be in two places at the same time. So we began our program hearing from the Honorable Pinda, but had hoped and now will provide the opportunity to hear from Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who is the president of AGRA, to also help us frame this in the context of all of the work that's being done on food systems development in Africa, recognizing that our soils and the utilization of fertilizer is a key part of the AGRF, now Africa Food Systems Summit mission. Please.
Thank you, Michael. I don't have any paper because I'm not going to make a speech. I just wanted to help put this particular session in context. A while ago, we started putting this session on the program because we were hoping that by now we would have had the Fertilizer Summit. We haven't had the Fertilizer Summit. In fact, the Fertilizer Summit is planned for 5 to 6 of November in Nairobi, Kenya. So you're all welcome to the Fertilizer Summit. And this is about making sure that we come to the Fertilizer Summit extremely prepared for that summit, because critical decisions are going to be made at that Fertilizer Summit. So this is an opportunity for us to start having those conversations around what has gone well post the last Head of State Fertilizer Summit, which was in 2006, what hasn't gone well, what new challenges do we have in our midst, and what new opportunities do we have in our midst, and how do we harness all these? So that's the conversation tonight, and it's not just about fertilizers. Fertilizers is just a little bit of the problem. There's an even bigger problem, like His Excellency just said, soil health and soil fertility management on this continent. So we look forward to this conversation and consider this the preparatory meeting that really prepares us for the Fertilizer Summit that is coming. I know there's still work to do in between now and November, but this gives us a chance to start setting the stage right. And thank you, Michael, and others that have been working very hard to getting this summit going. So thank you again, and back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalibata. We are very pleased to have an additional framing presentation for this afternoon's deliberations. Again, we're talking about Africa's fertilizer and soil health vision. We have Mr. Tom Kehoe, who is the Deputy Director of Agriculture for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who will provide context and in particularly, it will speak to the overall theme, but because of the work of BMGF in supporting a program called Sustain Africa, and I don't know if that's in your remarks or not, it speaks to the first theme, because after his remarks, we'll have a panel discussion, which is under the theme, Reinventing Africa's Fertilizer Industry in a Context of Global Crisis. So many of us in the room are in the process of trying to make lemonade out of the lemons that we've dealt with over the last 3 or 4 years. First, COVID, then the crisis in Ukraine, backstopped against continuing climate change disasters, and more recently, the decline in African currencies to the US dollar, which is the currency of trade for fertilizer. So we are very pleased to have Tom to come and give us our framing presentation, and thereafter I will call to the stage our 6 panelists for our first session. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. See if I can. Somebody know how to put up the presentation? There we go. Yeah, I clicked ahead quite a few. All right. One of the things I think when we look at fertilizer, soil health, and adoption, in particularly in Africa, is it has to be the incentive for smallholders, farmers, to be able to want to adopt and look at adopting. And ultimately that looks at the overall markets and what they're doing. So we always kind of start with what's going on globally, because what happens globally has dramatic impact in Africa. And so just to give everybody a quick snapshot, just focus on that top left graph there. And what you'll see is those 2 red bands, that represents 2 ranges in what global agriculture trades in terms of the stock-to-use ratio. So that gold line, that is the percentage of inventory we have left at the end of the year on all major grain and oilseeds globally. As you can see, when it gets up to 19%, suddenly that's a surplus. The market sends signals to the farmers, we don't need more. In fact, you create farm crises in terms of profitability. And it tells the market, we're getting long food, we're getting short food. You only got to go down 3 percentage points and you spark a food crisis, right? So it's a very narrow band that we trade in, but it's a cyclical band. So some key messages here is, we're still falling behind. In the last 4 years, we have actually consumed more than we produced, even though we've had record crops globally. So that consumption rate ticks up at 2.2% a year pretty consistently on a global scale. So every year, the food systems globally needs to produce more. Now, fortunately, when we look at 2023, which is actually just starting right now, 23-24 season, we are forecasting a projection to go back up above that 16% threshold line, which really kind of sparks a food crisis. But it's telling us we're not that far out of the crisis. So the lesson here for us is we're moving up, but we're in very, very precocious situation. How does that look for Africa? So in sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at the left graph, that's looking at total production, again, of just the major grains and oilseeds in sub-Saharan Africa versus the use. It's actually quite interesting when you look and see that the projected rate of consumption has been moving at a 3.5%, and when we look at consumption, it's actually 3.4%, or production 3.4%. So we're not trailing that far behind, and we're doing pretty well. And actually, when you look at the bottom right-hand graph, that's actually looking at the net deficit on all major grains and oilseeds. And it's quite encouraging to say that we've been around the 37 million tons for about 8 years now. This is despite consumption dramatically increasing, right? We're increasing at a rate of about 3.5% in sub-Saharan Africa. We are actually holding pace in the last 5 to 6 years against that. Now, you can say there's a significant gap of about 40 million tons, but when you look at that gap, you got to go a little bit deeper and say, where's that gap coming from? So here's the same numbers looking at maize versus rice. And when you look at maize, look at the consumption line on the top left corner versus production. We're keeping up. We're keeping pace. In fact, you can't go beyond that. When you look at going beyond that consumption line, that means you need to be going into global exports. That means you need to be competing onto the global market. So, on maize, if you want to double maize productivity through increased fertilizer adoption, The market will not allow you to do that ever. So you can put $1 billion into doubling the productivity of maize. It's not going to happen this year, next year, or the year after, unless you can get to a global competitive situation. Another way to think about it is we got a 1 million ton deficit in Kenya, right? Pretty consistently drought. If you fill that deficit, if you create increased production in Kenya to fill that 1 million ton deficit, you're going to lose production out of Tanzania and Uganda, who are filling that market. So we need to start thinking about different solution sets if we want to increase the potential of African agriculture. Rice is a different story, right? So the only two major commodities we're importing anymore is rice and wheat. And there, you got to start thinking about David Ricardo's comparative advantage, if anybody's an economist history buff. Should we be growing rice? Should we be growing wheat? What does that look like? It's going to be a different story country by country. But definitely markets is one of the largest constraints we look at when we need to think about fertilizer. Now, in saying that, we've just came through a global fertilizer crisis, and we got asked to think about a few thoughts in terms of what is a few of the high-level lessons we've learned. And I think first one overall is, obviously, fertilizer matters. I mean, the shocks we've seen in fertilizer prices did actually reduce usage. It did come down in terms of the amount farmers used this past season, and that's resulted in record increases in food prices. So ultimately, this matters. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to fertilizer. Another good lesson was coordination. Coordination works. I think we stumbled a little bit at the start, but actually getting public sector, private sector, getting all the different international institutions, local institutions, getting them around the table to say, what do we do? That actually turned out to be quite successful, and lots of good things that came out of there. Being part of the Sustain Network, we were actually very impressed with the response from private sector. And how they actually stood up to the table, not only put dollars on the table, but took significant risks in the markets. But we didn't see much policies targeted at alleviating that risk that we've seen in the private sector, yet they're a huge piece of that puzzle, not only from the international supplier level, but right down to the distribution level. Obviously, fertilizer use efficiencies. And the other bigger lessons, I would say, is incentives work, right? We've gone through a major shock to the food system. And on the fertilizer side, Russian suppliers figured out a way around sanctions. International firms figured out ways to increase production. Farmers around the world responded. We've came out of this quickly because incentives work. But we've also seen areas where incentives got broken. And so what does that mean? And I'd like to take a little bit of a deeper dive on here. And this is where I think we need to get better in projecting forward food crisis, is that smallholder farmers do respond to market incentives. This is an email exchange with one of my good friends. He's a trader out of Zambia. He's an absolute genius when it comes to southern markets. And him and I were actually talking about palm oil versus soybean oil. We're in a little bit of a debate. And then he flagged to me on the fertilizer issue. And you can see this was in June of 2022. And in June 22, he said, hey, look at the incentives the smallholders farmers seeing. I'm really concerned they're going to switch from maize to soybean. If we do that, if we reduce fertilizer, we're going to be long beans, and we're going to have a food crisis in Malawi 2024 of January, 18 months from now, 18 months from when he wrote the email. So we're still 6 months away from January 2024, but we can already see what's happened to the market because of the incentives smallholders seen in June. Maize price has gone up 135%, so it's over doubled in a long way, and that's in US dollars. It's over tripled in local currency. And soybeans has gone down. We've seen a 25% reduction in beans. Why? Smallholder farmers looked at the economics. They do what every farmer around the world is, and they made the appropriate choice for what they're facing. So incentives mean a lot when it comes to even African agriculture, and you can't get away from them. Obviously, this was the situation. We didn't need to go over it, but there's two problems in Malawi. Not only did you have the fertilizer price, but because they had produced a surplus, they were actually long maize, they had a historical very low maize price. I think it was around 160, 170, which is below break even in a normal fertilizer price environment. So how do we get better at understanding what those incentives are for farmers, what behaviors is that going to kick off, and then what does that mean from some of the food security challenges we have or market growth potential. Another thing to look forward into is saying, what do we do about this? Pretty adamant that we need to prepare for the next shock. What are some of the lessons we can do from the last year and put those into a vault, put those behind a piece of glass that says break in case of emergency. This is my first time being in the development side of the world when we've had a food crisis, and it amazed me how unprepared we were for something that's a known event. This is going to happen every 6 to 7 years. It's a cyclical business. How do we get more prepared? How do we understand what it is we need to do, who needs to be talking to do, and how do we get from it? A few things is, the availability. We've seen high levels of working capital constraint at the distribution level especially. So if your fertilizer increases by 3x, you need 3 times the amount of working capital that you needed previously. Balance sheets are already stretched. We need to be able to have support to come in there and backstop that with guarantees, such as the AFFM is working on and AFAP is working on, to say, in a time of crisis, can we have that standing mechanism ready to go to ramp up guarantees from the development to multilaterals to say, we'll backstop you with that risk. Better visibility on the incentive structure is what I've talked to. When those break, when you're having a heart attack, when the market is saying do not do something that is super important for food security, is that a time to intervene? And then when we look at policies, a lot of work needs to be done around how do you actually take risk out of the system, not every day, but under those extreme environments, because ultimately it's not governments who deliver fertilizer, it's the industry. Agnes already talked about the AU Fertilizer Soil Health Summit. That's a super important point for African leaders to step up and make their own vision, to declare their own vision for what it looks like in terms of soil health and fertilizer on the continent. The two I want to go a little bit further on is, one is the nutrient roadmap and then soil health. So when we look at nutrient roadmap, what we're looking for is to say, listen, if market's a constraint, then what is the conceivable market you can serve? What does that look like out into 2040? And what does that mean from a nutrient requirement you would need to be able to grow that food production? So it's a different way of looking at it, but it also actually frames it into what the potential is from an actual incentive structure. So this is preliminary. It's not accurate, so don't quote those numbers down. But if you take Tanzania today and you forecast what food consumption is out to 2040, which is pretty easy to do. It's population growth, there's some assumptions around economic growth, and that's pretty predictable in terms of what the demand pattern would be, right? If you consume that or take that out to 2040, you can say this is what consumption is going to look like. What is production going to look like? It's coming down with climate change, right? But what's not baked into this number, is there's zero genetic gain. So we know Tari is going to produce better seeds. There's zero land extensification. We know farmers are going to plant more acres over the next 20 years. And there's zero agronomic gain. So this is a super conservative number. In fact, the actual amount of nutrients you'll need to 2040 is going to be significantly less once we finish the modeling work. But even with all of those other assumptions not even included, we're putting all of those at zero, and we're saying climate change is going to have an effect. By 2040, if you want to be at 110% self-sufficiency, which means you're basically servicing the Kenya market and the Rwanda market as you are today. So under the current market structure on these major grains, you'll need 50 kgs of nutrients, right? So really understanding what good looks like. We set the Malibu target in 2006 at 50 kgs. From the current market, future market potential, but the current market structure, you actually don't need that amount of fertilizer until 2040. So if your goal is to double yields, productivity, and increase Tanzania agriculture to 50 kgs per hectare, wait till 2040 or start thinking differently about what you're going to do for market potential and access. Last thing, because I only have 10 minutes, 1 minute. Soil health. This is a picture that I've shown several times, but this is in Tanzania. This was shared with me by the commercial manager country manager from Yara several years ago. In the foreground is a farmer named Otto who has a beautiful crop. I think he said he got 8 or 9 tons per hectare off of that crop. In the background is the smallholders' fields. They're barren, they're brown. You would swear that that field was irrigated. That field didn't have irrigation. All it had was better root depth and it had better soil. That stopped a drought because there was an interim drought within the growing season. Smallholders lost their crops. This farmer had a beautiful crop. The economic cost of one drought in Tanzania compared to the cost of starting to make serious progress on soil health is mind-blowing. So encouraged to hear what the panelists have to say. Where does the innovation needed? How do we actually address this picture here? So thank you.
So colleagues, I'm going to just tell you right up front, everybody who will come to the stage this afternoon is very passionate about these things. So I didn't want to pull Tom off, and I don't know whether that was his last slide or not, but we have a very dynamic lineup of panelists, and we also want to give them a chance to share with you. But I think he is framing some of the issues that we're dealing with, particularly recognizing that our smallholder farmers are contributing to the food system and the business of food. I want to invite our 6 panelists up, and the way that we'll run the panel is that we have a set of questions that we will ask them to respond to, and then I want to make sure that actually the chairman of our board is ready, because he will come up shortly thereafter. We're going to do this very quickly. But is the Honorable Ernesto Max Elias Tonella, who is the Minister of Economic and Finance from Mozambique. Is he in the house? I haven't seen him or met him. The next panelist, I'll keep going, Ms. Dina Esposito, who is the Assistant to the Administrator, Resilience and Food Security from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Please come up. Mr. Mehdi Filali, who is the Vice President, Farmer Solutions from OCP Africa. Please also join us on stage. Mr. Sven Tore Hastetler, who's the President and CEO of Yara. Please join us. Mr. Henk Van Jen, who is the CEO and President of the International Fertilizer Development Center. Please also come and join us. And lastly but not least, Mr. Patrick Heffer, who is the Deputy Director General of the International Fertilizer Association. Please also join us. So colleagues, you have heard the framing remarks, and these are all areas that you work in on a daily basis. But I want to start actually with Hank and Patrick, because one of the things that we want to know as we prepare for the summit is how can the Africa fertilizer industry be reinvented to address the unique challenges and opportunities of the continent today. And I think I will start with you, Patrick, because you represent the industry association from a very big picture, and then I'll ask the same question to Hank.
So, thank you, Michael. And here in that part of the room, we don't hear you that well. So, but I know more or less what is your question about. I would like address both the supply side and the fertilizer use side. So, according to what I have heard since yesterday, there is really a consensus that we need to produce more fertilizers in Africa to reduce reliance on imports, to reduce our exposure to future crises. We know there will be others, we don't know when. And also, because African farmers, today they compete with farmers from the rest of the world, but tomorrow they are also likely to compete with other industries. especially the shipping industry, which might use ammonia as a preferred fuel to substitute fossil fuels. So low carbon technologies offer great opportunities, and here can be ammonia production with carbon capture and storage and use, or it can be using as well renewable energy, whether that's solar, wind, hydro, or geothermal energy, and there is plenty of these across Africa. And more recently, if we look even further to the future, there might be opportunities in terms of using what we call geologic hydrogen, which can be drilled and could serve as well as a raw material for producing nitrogen fertilizers. So there is potential. And what is interesting with these technologies, especially green ammonia technology using renewable, is that it can be decentralized, can be considered not only with the current model where, let's say, nitrogen fertilizer production is made largely where you have large availabilities of natural gas. Here it could be done in different parts of Africa where you have these renewable energies, and it could be done also at different scales, from small to large scale. Also something important, and that was mentioned several times in terms of supply, is not only about fertilizers. There is a need to address soil pH, and therefore a need for the fertilizer industry to partner with the liming industry. On the fertilizer use side now, we need to be more farmer-centric. It means developing solutions that are relevant to the farmers, that will help them improve crop productivity, improve profitability, and also be more resilient. And what we see already in the fertilizer industry, and that will continue in the future, is that companies are moving from, let's say, supplying mineral fertilizers to providing plant nutrition solutions. That's not only mineral fertilizers, that can be organic fertilizers, can be microbials, can be digital solutions to help farmers apply fertilizer more efficiently. And we can even go further and be provider of farming solutions. And finally, I would say soil health. That's also something that needs to be paid due attention by the industry. Several members of the IFA are involved in soil mapping, in soil testing. By the way, one of the nicest soil testing laboratory can be found in one of our member companies in South Africa. So in Africa, there are also companies with very strong soil health management capacities. And lastly, human nutrition and health. So we talked about soil health, but there is a clear link as well with human nutrition and health. And here there is a potential with agronomic biofortification by adding micronutrients, especially zinc, selenium, and iodine to fertilizers to improve the human intake in these nutrients and improve human health. Thank you.
Fertilizer potentially on the continent is particularly interesting, but all of the points that you mentioned are quite relevant. I want to move to you, Hank, because IFDC, I know, works globally, but you have a particular focus on the continent. In repeating the question, just to make sure that you have it top of mind, how can the Africa fertilizer industry be reinvented to address the unique challenges and opportunities of the continent?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It's an interesting question. And I will not say anything more that Patrick already mentioned about the innovative power of the industry, because I think that's what is needed. And like Dr. Kalibata mentioned, the summit was foreseen in June, but now is in November. So this meeting at the AGRF creates the opportunity to work together towards the summit. Because in the end, there is a direct need of innovation and collaboration between the industry on this side, where we are sitting now, and the farmer community and academia to address fertilizer and soil health as on a holistic way. to assure that mineral fertilizer contributes to improvement of soil and soil health, contributes to agriculture productivity, but looking at it from a holistic perspective. A bit in line with what Patrick said is there is a need from the industry to look at how can you add micronutrients, microbiology, stimulants to your fertilizer, which is used by farmers, to improve your soil health. And I think that's the main request to all of you, also for the summit and for the next 10 years. How can we innovate in a local way to assure that farmers have access to nutrients, which are maybe locally produced when we look at manure or other local sources of nutrients? And how can we add mineral fertilizers available mostly from abroad to assure that there is higher productivity? And like Tom Keogh said, our 50 kgs, which we stated in 2006 in Abuja, luckily we still have 20 years left to assure that we can use 50 kgs in average. We are now roughly at 19 in Africa. So we still have some time to build up to 50 kgs. But also the thinking of 50 kgs in Abuja 2006 in comparison to what we think in the summit 2023 is changed. So there are opportunities for different nutrients, different sources of nutrients which are locally available, including the fertilizers which we bring in from the industry present here. So innovation is the power, but innovation together is the only way forward to address fertilizer and soil health. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. And I think we're very fortunate to have two of the fertilizer industry representatives with us, key executives, one the CEO and one, again, a leading executive, to talk to us about some of the innovations that they're involved with, because one of the things that is happening is there's greater focus on efficacy from the fertilizer that is sold, and how do we increase yields in some instances with less fertilizer. So I'm pleased to ask first Sven, your thoughts on what role can innovation and technology play in transforming the Africa fertilizer industry and ensuring sustainable agricultural practice?
Well,
and Mehdi, I'll ask you the same question after. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So it can play a huge role. So I'm here as a private sector player, and I'd like to approach this from a business case point of view and look at the opportunity now related to agriculture and how we grow food, and definitely fertilizer plays a major role in that. But we have seen now how vulnerable the supply chains are. First through COVID, we see it with conflict, geopolitical tension, causing price spikes and shortages. Look at climate, it's hard to think of any profession more directly impacted by climate change than farming. And we need to de-risk the food system, and we need to grow food more places. And if you look at the big picture here now, Africa has a unique opportunity. It also stands to double the population from now until 2050. But already today there's a deficit. The food import bill in Africa is between $50 and $75 billion a year, so there's a huge captive market. But there's also the opportunity here to think about exports, and we heard that from Tom's opening remarks as well, that there is an export opportunity if we get the productivity right and use fertilizer in the right way. That's a key part of this. But then we need to think of this as a business as well. And farmers are running small businesses, so let's treat them like business people and focus on nutrient use efficiency, and also establishing that fertilizer is not fertilizer. It needs to be tailored directly to the needs of the farmer, to the crop, and to the soil, so that we add back the right nutrients at the right time and not too much either, because then you risk doing more harm than good. And here with technology, the knowledge that previously would only be available to large-scale farmers can now be in the hand of the smallholder farmers through mobile phones or smartphones. And but then we need to have a supportive framework around that. And Sustain Africa was mentioned, which is a great direct initiative to support predictability for farmers, making sure they get the right nutrients, and also the direct impact that came from that should serve as an inspiration for how policy is created for the long term and much broader than Sustain Africa as well. And we see it every day that when we're out in the fields working with the farmers, instead of just focusing on 3 major nutrients, if you add 3-4 more nutrients, as we do in the MyCrop solution, you get a much more complex solution to the farmer, and we see the immediate impact to the yields, which again turn this into businesses. So for us from the fertilizer industry, it isn't about just pushing maximum amount of fertilizer. It's about doing it in the right way, with tailored solutions, working with the farmers, focusing on soil health. Because when you get soil health for free, where you get soil health, you get so many other things for free. It's more resistant to drought, to flooding, to heat, and also to cold spells. And on top of it, you get more nutritious food. And the fertilizer industry certainly has a role to play in that, but it's one that we cannot do alone. We need to do this in partnerships across the value chains, but also with governments to get this right. Thanks.
No, excellent. Thank you for that. Mehdi, I'd like to have you share with the colleagues the work that OCP is doing in terms of innovating both with the product, but also in helping some of the SMEs that are part of the value chain for distribution. Please.
Yes. Thank you very much, Michael, for the question. Please enable me to answer to the question about reinventing, how to reinvent.
Can you hear in the back? I just want to make sure. I think you just move your mic a little bit closer to you.
It's better like this? Okay. So I was saying, please enable me to answer to the question about how to reinvent our industry.
Please.
I think if we take at global level, I think we have to shift our paradigm. We have to transit from extreme intensive farming to new sustainable models. And those new sustainable models should have soil health at the center of those models. For sure, at Africa, we are not at this level because we are suffering from low productivity. But I believe that we should do a shortcut and apply directly those new sustainable model based on soil health at the center. To do so, we should apply a scientific approach. First of all, we should understand our soils and their complexity. What are the needs of our soils? What are the cycles? What are the constituents of health of our soils? Then, so for that, at OCP Group, we are investing heavily in digital soil mapping to understand first the needs of our soils, and we have been conducting digital soil mapping in 50 million hectares across the continent with our international and local partners and research institutions and universities. And also we are investing a lot in integrated soil health management approach by working in various programs in more than 10 countries that are developing solutions that are targeting more than 90 million hectares of integrated soil health management in terms of finding solutions to acidic soils, finding solutions to high salinity soils, improving the biodiversity of soils and microbiome. And this is, for us, the first step to get an efficient fertilization. Then when we get all this knowledge about the soil, we can develop the efficient fertilization through various approach. One of them, it is the 4R, right nutrients, right place, right time, and right rate. And this combined with a customization approach, bringing just the needed nutrients of the soil and the crops, enable us to increase the productivity. And we have some examples with our demo plots. We have been conducting just this year 5,000 demo plots across the continent to disseminate all this good agronomic practice. We have been noticing an increase of yield between 20 to 40% in crops like maize, rice, and potatoes in Rwanda, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and in Ethiopia. To emphasize this, when we combine this 4R and the customization approach with integrated soil health management, the increase of yield can be even much higher. And we are noticing an increase of yield that can exceed 100%, for example, in teff, in Ethiopia, and also in maize, in rice, and in pine nuts in Côte d'Ivoire. So for us, this is the best way to reinvent, let's say, our industry to support the food security in the continent in a sustainable way.
No, thank you. I think from your remarks and some of the conversations we've had so far, because as we plan for the African Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit 2023, we have looked back at 2006, and I think one of the big differences is this greater concentration on soil health and the impact of soil health in terms of creating the yield. So appreciate those remarks. I'd like to have our last question posed to Dina, and you've had a chance to hear from the colleagues. In what ways, because it hadn't been mentioned, it kind of was mentioned in Hank's presentation about the private sector on this side of the lake, if you will, and then the global private sector. But in what ways do you see the private sector being able to collaborate with governments and also international organizations toward driving investment and innovation in terms of improving Africa's fertilizer industry?
Thank you so much for the question, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with our private sector, international organization, association partners, social enterprises. This is the kind of partnerships that I think we're talking about to deliver on the vision for the African Union Soil Health and Fertilizer Summit and Action Plan. USAID is a development agency. We invest about $1 billion a year in our Global Hunger Initiative, which is called Feed the Future. And Africa receives more than any other region of the world of those resources. About 45% of that money each year comes here. And while that's significant, it pales in comparison to the problem set. And so we really see our role as first and foremost helping governments create the right enabling environment that incentivizes private sector, and then working with private sector to address market failures and de-risk assessments, investments through a whole variety of different kinds of public-private partnerships. And so I wanted to answer your question both kind of looking back at the onset of the global fertilizer crisis after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then kind of looking forward to the kind of recovery, regenerate, and act together. Looking back, we know that it was not only an availability problem for fertilizer, but also an access issue and a utilization issue. And we began working with OCP and YARA on our missions across Africa to try to connect their offer, their very generous offer of free or discounted fertilizer directly to the most impacted smallholder farmers, recognizing the potential for arbitrage and other things, having it get diverted. And so we began working very closely with the private sector. We combined that with a partnership with AFAP on fertilizer financing, which we've talked about is such an important, was an important gap in the system. And then also coupling it with access to other kinds of vitally needed improved inputs, because costs for all inputs for farmers had gone up. So improved seed, improved advisory services, the financing, digital technologies, and we bundled all of that together in a crisis response program we call the Accelerated Innovation Delivery Initiative, with the goal of reaching 6 million farmers through 2 cropping seasons, the one that's passed and the one that's coming, in an effort to sustain crop production and food security on the continent. And that's how we got to know Sustain Africa, which is a partnership, I think, of everybody here on this stage and many others, was really an innovation in its own right to bring together partners to address this crisis, not just relying on humanitarians to deliver a solution, but recognizing the importance of development actors in this space and providing this donated or subsidized fertilizers in a really smart way without distorting markets and getting it out to farmers. So we're really pleased to be able to announce $5 million today to Sustain Africa for this last phase. It's not something that needs to be around all the time, but it's super important that we get the lessons learned right, what worked, what didn't. How do we put on the shelf a rapid mobilization mechanism so we're not mucking around and losing a lot of time the way we did, I think, the first time around, and really recognizing that early warning, early response is not just a humanitarian issue, it's a development agenda, and incorporating risk into our investments becomes so important. So that's kind of on the looking back side. On the looking forward side, AID is really focused on these issues of if fertilizer is available, how do we really facilitate access and utilization? We really came to understand as we reflected on the problem that those farmers who are using fertilizer on the continent were often using 2 to 4 times more than they actually needed. And that really comes to the fore when you don't have a lot of fertilizer, right? How do you use it more efficiently? And that those who did use it were getting a very poor return on their investment. The productivity was just really not there. And so we do intend to invest significantly in soil health and fertilizer use efficiency that we have in the past, but this really becomes even more central. As you've said, it's really the crisis. If there's a silver lining to the crisis, it's that it's really built a huge amount of momentum and consensus around this very issue. And now we have the Soil Health and Fertilizer Summit, which gives us all the moment to come together with a collaboration and a coordinated plan. We are, as part of our investment there, we'll be talking more about it there, scaling an approach that we call space to place, because it combines geospatial technology, soil mapping, improved soil mapping, with on-farm knowledge and advisory services. Very much as you've described, that OCP is one of many organizations that actually have come around to it. They may not call it space to place, but it's an approach that's coming across the continent, and we're committed to scaling that approach in 4 to 5 agroecological zones in partnership with governments and all of the folks here and beyond, really to get the right fertilizer in the right amounts, in the right place at the right time, to improve the value proposition of using fertilizer and improving productivity. Ethiopia, as you've mentioned, is already scaling this approach because it has been demonstrated to reduce fertilizer wastage by up to 80% and improve on-farm productivity. It is combined with this integrated soil fertility management approach because we know that just the fertilizer alone is not delivering on what's needed. And so it's an important integration of approaches, and one that private sector fertilizer companies, development organizations, social enterprises, and more are really looking at. So we invite others to join us to make investments that contribute to the Soil Health and Fertilizer Action Plan, to come to that meeting, but even more importantly, to stay on to figure out how we're going to get a broad coalition of really diverse partners together to deliver on the plan, because it's a very integrated, it's not just about soil health, or fertilizer use efficiency. It's about finance, it's about trade, it's about policy and regulatory reform. And so it will take a broad coalition of partners, and we're very much looking forward to working with all of you on that.
Thank you very much. I am mindful of time, because I know that there are probably questions, and I would have liked to have a second round, but I want to ask you all to give a round of applause for our first panel.